Welcome everyone to the Eye for Eye conversation series. I'm joined by the wonderful Yamini Aiyar, who's called a public policy scholar. And in fact, at some point, I'm going to ask her, what does the scholarship of public policy mean? Yamini is well known to many of us who follow the Ideas for India platform for her writing, for her deep engagement on many issues on state capacity and state capability, the two terms, which we'll also try and unpack the linkages between the two. She's currently a visiting senior fellow at the Saxena Center for Contemporary South Asia and the Watson Institute at Brown University. Previously, she was the president for the Center for Policy Research and led and set up Accountability Initiative. And she has had many avatars before that. Yamini, it's a pleasure to talk with you, particularly in the context of the release of your recent book, which I hope everyone can see here. Lessons in State Capacity from Delhi Schools, Yamini, where in a way the book is a synthesis of, I think, a lot of your thinking and writing around questions of the state, very much grounded in years of qualitative research, in conversation with quantitative data as well, on the granular realities of schools in Delhi and reforms in schools, in particular in Delhi. So, before we get into sort of broader questions and analysis and think about theoretical frameworks, I think perhaps my first question to you would be, what are the lessons in state capacity? So, if the book is called Lessons in State Capacity from Delhi Schools, what are these lessons? What is it that you want the reader to really hone in on? And what do you take away from all this research and what's captured in the book? And then we'll move into some broader questions.
So Shrayana, we were sitting in these classrooms in Delhi, and we wanted to try and ensure that we had a little more of a learning outcome than what the average government school going student in India has. So Asar tells us 50% of children in Standard 5 can barely read a Standard 2 text. So hopefully our learning outcomes were a little better, and we learned some lessons which I'll talk to you about in a second. But before I get into the meat of everything, just a very quick, first of all, thank you very much, Shrayana, for being so willing to have this conversation with me. So many of my adventures in state capacity started with you. So it's a real pleasure to build on some of those early ideas and those thinking in conversation with you. A special thanks also to Ideas for India for hosting this conversation, enabling it to happen. And it's a particular privilege, not just because I'm on the editorial board of the Ideas for India, but I have seen, read, learned from Ideas for India from the day it was launched, and have had the pleasure of writing in very often in Ideas for India. And some of the early thinking that led into this book, particularly around the work that my colleagues and I did in Bihar, first found its voice on Eye for Eye. So it's a special moment for me and for this work to now in its full form unfold on Eye for Eye and in conversation with the wonderful Shrayana. To the lessons. Look, I think the biggest lesson we learned from sitting in classrooms in public schools in Delhi was that everything that we know so far in the scholarly literature and the debates on state capacity offer a thin slice, and they miss a very fundamental point about state capacity because it looks at it from the top down and not from the bottom up. Let me explain. We broadly, for the sake of definition, because state capacity means many things to many people, in this work, we think of state capacity very much as largely the implementation capacity of the Indian state. It's a commonly articulated headache for most who are in the world of policy, that the Indian state knows how to make policy. It all fails in implementation. And broadly, everybody agrees that it is at the heart of implementation where the policy ideas that are framed in on the top somehow are unable to translate onto the ground. The famous Land-Pritchett framing of the flailing state, which is at the heart of the capacity challenge that India has. And the reasons behind this are understood broadly in the literature on development economics, in the literature on political science. For the sake of generalization, I'll put these in three categories. They overlap, no doubt. First and foremost, political political will. So the politics, often the elite politics, the kind of prioritization that politicians have for what are the most critical places or spaces where state capacity needs to be built up simply doesn't exist when it comes to public services. I should add that I am talking specifically about state capacity for the delivery of core public services, and all would agree that the delivery of public education is part and parcel of precisely that. So politics, and in India particularly, the great puzzle, why is it that a democracy, a vibrant democracy in which welfare often finds its way into electoral competition, has rarely competed around the core delivery of education, health, the quality of roads, and so on and so forth, which is a puzzle that is repeatedly placed in front of us at the start of any electoral cycle in India. The second framing thinks about it very much in terms of the human resources and the skills, and then bridges it into thinking about it from the point of view of incentives and interests, right? So, is there something about the structure of the terms of the contract that essentially ensure that the front lines of the state are caught in distortionary networks, and the front lines of the state are essentially function like a market, which incentivize broad-based corruption and incompetence, which ensure that the idea never gets translated on the ground. And then the third, which kind of builds on this in some ways, but from a political economy lens, talks about the distortionary nature of politics on the ground and the blurred boundaries between state and society that ensure that the structure of state power at the grassroots is designed such that it privileges particularistic interests. It's transactional. It's focused on specific interests that capture state power. Those are largely elite interests, but democracy mobilizes all kinds of interest groups within society. And even lower caste mobilization has essentially led to capture of state power to serve particularist interests rather than broad-based delivery of public goods. So it is about local political economy and those dynamics that essentially mean that the state engages with citizens, not as citizens, but by specific interest groups. And it engages giving of patronage and in clientelist networks rather than broad-based in forms of active public universalist public service delivery to all. So those are broadly the three ways in which we think about state capacity. And it's interesting that in none of these framings do we actually talk about the state itself, except perhaps when we say incentives in terms of contract, where we're thinking largely about the fact that these are, civil service jobs. They are, once you enter in, you can't fire, the nature of the recruitment, etc. And so when we start talking about how do you build in performance incentives and other such things, rather than asking about the structure of the state, the dynamics of the state, and what the state thinks of itself. And the reason I say this is because the biggest lesson I learned from sitting inside schools in Delhi, in fact, this work in sitting in schools across different parts of the country on hanging out with block education officers, with district education officers, basically spending time and listening to the front lines of the state, that in fact there is something very specific ways in which the front line of the state function in terms of the rules, the hierarchies, the processes within which they are embedded, the organizational culture that yields, and how that shapes the personal beliefs of the frontline actors in terms of their own notion of purpose and performance. That is also part and parcel of what makes state capacity. So when we talk about the flailing state, you will have enough examples, and one of the motivating stories at the start of this book is a meeting I was sitting at in the government of Bihar, coming off of an RCT, which effectively showed us that the teachers in the context of a summer camp, public government school teachers trained in a particular way with sets of textbooks were able to, through the process of the summer camp, engage in a pedagogical engagement with students such that learning outcomes increase substantively. And the same students and the same teachers, when they go back into the routine of the classroom, fail to continue in the same practices and see learning outcomes. And so, the government officials, after this long conversation, are scratching their heads saying, our real challenge challenge is how do you take this summer camp, this mission, this small moment, and routinize it into the everyday of service delivery. And if you look across the range of our cities, that tells us what the specific technical tools that we need to put into play, the technocratic fixes, the kinds of fixes that are needed to ensure that the plumbing and the leaky pipes are plugged, somehow they don't get entrenched and embedded. And to me, therefore, the real lesson in state capacity came from trying to ask this question: what is it that stops these ideas from being embedded in the system and seeing sustainable long term change? And when you start listening to the front line, you begin to understand that it's not just a challenge of incentives and political economy, those are part and parcel of the story, but there's a very critical piece here of how the state at the front lines sees itself, its own organizational culture, the degree to which that culture is aligned with the purpose of public service delivery. And it is in the interstices, therefore, of the everyday relationships, the processes, the rules, the hierarchies of the front lines of the state that state capacity is weakened, and also, the biggest lesson of all, that state capacity can be strengthened. So I close the book saying that state capacity for me is actually about what I call identifying the interstitial spaces of state capacity. That's what the reform effort in Delhi government showed me. It wasn't a big bang, huge change, slow boring on the hard board. The presence of consistent mentor teachers who were ambassadors in some senses of some of the pedagogical ideas in the reform, the consistent and regular infusion of short goal-oriented missions that expose teachers who were reluctant and resistant to a lot of the ideas that they experienced change with. They saw positive outcomes when they were outside of the classroom using these new ideas, but always resisted drawing them into the classroom because there was a whole set of other factors that they felt were dominant in what made it harder for them to think about improving learning outcomes, which is the core of the bit of the Delhi reforms that we were studying in standards 6 to 8. It was called Chunauti. Over time, it morphed into something called Mission Bunyad that we were studying. That these regular infusions of missions, exposing teachers to the possibilities of change, started aligning their thinking to the purpose of the classroom, which is to actually educate children. And the real change came about in this tiny little interstitial space, the staff room, where teachers would always hang out and complain all the time, as they do about everything about the system, the hierarchies, all of these things that made it hard for them to get their jobs done. But suddenly, those complaints also integrated into them a story of, there were these three kids at the back of the classroom. We've been trying these different things, nothing is working. They may not be able to pass the exam. That was the real first step towards shifting beliefs, shifting practices, and in these interstitial spaces, putting in the building blocks for building state capacity. So, state capacity, slow boring of hard boards, not through anything, but through identifying those interstitial spaces within the state and carefully nurturing them to build the building blocks of big normative changes in the organizational culture and value system of the bureaucratic system. That's what I learned through studying schools in Delhi.
Yeah, I mean, it's so refreshing and fascinating, and it's always refreshing to hear you on the state. I think I've said this to you privately, and now I'll risk saying it publicly at this forum. I have a lot of discussion on state capacity, and as someone who deals with bureaucrats day in, day out, right? That's my life. I feel like a lot of the writing and thinking, often by economists, is what I like to call the Thakela school of state capacity. It's frameworks that I think a long history of even studying RCTs carefully tells us does not scale and does not work. And I think thinking about it now in terms of these sites of reform, it's the staff room, it's these other social sites, is such a different and refreshing way of approaching the problem. And you're right, it's hard work. It's certainly not sexy. It's not simple, and it sort of strays from the world of the technocratic. But let me use that then, this what you talked about these interstitial spaces, to talk about maybe three ways, and maybe each question of mine will address three ways that I do notice the economics literature really tends to think about the state, how to give advice around the state, and how to fix the state, right? The first one is incentives, and I think you picked up on it because a lot of this depends on the framing of relationships within the state as contracts as opposed to social relations, right? And I think that is the fundamental difference between perhaps the political science, sociology lens of thinking about the state vis-a-vis the way economists come at it. What do we know in the world of education? And you've studied this inside out. You've been part of so many debates. I feel like you've started some of the debates. What do we know about, do incentives work in the context of improving, punishing, penalizing, or praising, rewarding the work of the frontline actor of the state? If they work in certain studies, do they scale? And from the staff rooms that you're hearing, perhaps incentives do work, but they need to be nuanced a bit. I think that's what I'm picking up from at least the reading in the book and a lot of your other writing. Could you speak to the literature of incentives, particularly in education reform or welfare reform? Because it often tends to be the first thing that we put on the toolkit, right, to think through
Mhm,
solutions, which is
mhm,
carrot and
mhm,
stick.
mhm.
Does carrot work and does stick work? And what are you learning about that approach from all your work?
Thanks, Shrayana. You really got to the heart of the problem around how we think about this question. I was struck a lot from some of the early days of, just hanging out in these district and block offices, and then coming back to the desk and going through the literature, just on how little we actually have, certainly on the public administration literature and the development economics literature, and even for that matter, the political science literature on the Indian state, on the internal dynamics of the state itself, and on ideas of worker motivation. And I look kind of across the seven seas to the literature on the United States, which many of us in public policy schools have been exposed to. We all read Herbert Kaufman and the Forest Rangers. We read Judith Tendler and the Good Governance in the Tropics. We all read Michael Lipsky and the frontline workers. I mean, so much of the literature on the frontline state, including, frankly, this book kind of comes out from his seminal work. I was just puzzled by the fact that we talk about incentives in terms of, performance incentives. When I first came into the development econ world and we were beginning to think about public, and in the public policy debates around budgets in India, inputs versus outcomes, outcome budgeting in the early 2000s became a big fad. Mia culpa. I too was part of all of that thinking. New public management ideas of performance-based incentives, kind of adopting market firm, private firm kind of principles into the government system. These were all being talked about in a big way and seen as kind of magic bullet solutions for what was happening. And it was, to me, it was a very simple puzzle. Nobody asks us in our professional life to do, there's kind of bare minimum things that you have to do. You got to meet a deadline eventually, since we're all good academics. You'll never meet the first deadline. You may not meet the 10th deadline, but by the 15th time, you have to just deliver, right? So you'll do that bare minimum. But there's all these other things that we do over and above that, including, for example, public service, of being engaged with Eye for Eye. And these are all part and parcel of what builds our professional identity and our sense of professional purpose. I was reminded of Kaufman's Forest Rangers, that was, trying to understand this puzzle of how do these forest rangers far, far away in the midst of, where nobody can be monitoring you and tracking you, where no kind of performance-based incentive structure is going to be actually implementable. And yet they were all going out and doing their jobs because they were so closely aligned to the core professional identity of what it meant to be a forest ranger. And the puzzle was, I was at the World Bank and working with Land Pritchett a lot at the time. And so a lot of his thinking also was quite influential, as he too was puzzling over precisely these questions, and, kind of framed it in this idea of account versus accountability. When we think about it in terms of incentives, we are largely thinking about accountability as an accounting issue, for which, inputs are the only way by which you can track, right? But what is it about the account, the way in which you legitimize your own role within the professional body to which you belong, that then motivates you to behave in. Why is it perfectly legitimate for school teacher not to show up to work. Or for that matter, as I heard consistently when talking to public school teachers, why is it perfectly legitimate for the teacher to consistently tell me that, yes, we all know, and this has kind of been the story of the last 12 to 15 years, that students come to school and they don't learn. And that is a very big challenge inside the classroom. But, here are broadly the reasons why we're not able to address this, because you see, because of the pay structure, because of all the paperwork that we are asked to do, because of the no detention policy after the right to education, that became a big thing that teachers would say, and of the whole range of excuses, and they would all lower their voices and say, madam, आपको कुछ समझ में नहीं आता, ये बच्चे जो स्कूल में आते हैं बहुत गरीब घर से आते हैं, madam, you will not understand, you come from Delhi, but most of the children who come here come from such poor households that the parents can't even be bothered to brush the children's hair before they come to school. That's why we can't teach. I mean, and it's a perfectly legitimate thing to say to somebody from the outside whom you don't know, to whom you're asking a very fundamental professional question: how do we address this challenge of 50% of children sitting in standard 5 that can't read a standard 2 text, which as a teacher you're broadly acknowledging. So what is it about the account? And I think that when we talk only about incentives, we miss this very tactile reality of the account, which shapes contracts everywhere. Actually, it's not just the performance incentive and the pay structure, that's part of it, but it is this, which is why you'll find repeatedly, one of the great puzzles about public sector in India is we have this high wages and low outcomes structure, right? And we say this is all about politics. It is, no question, that plays a role, but it is also because the core purpose, the social value of government jobs, has been aligned in such a way that the expectation is that government will pay you a certain high wage. But that is the core purpose then of what the government is supposed to be. So people want government jobs for access to state power and access to and the social value of government jobs. And our challenge is not to say that you are going to be able to break this down by putting in performance incentives, because we have RCT after RCT to tell us that that actually is hard to do at scale, but to say what is it that we can do to acknowledge this social reality and see if we can repurpose, realign the whole public sector in a way that it aligns also with the core purpose of what the school system is. Because when we interviewed teachers, and we did this survey in Delhi, that we refer to in the book, and one of the questions we were asking, we surveyed 200 teachers, why is it that they became a school teacher? And then we also mapped that with deep case studies of some of the teachers that we followed. And teacher after teacher there are two parts to the story. One is the government job and the high wage. But the second part of the story always is, and sometimes it comes before the government job and high wage bit, is about for a genuine love for teaching. And the real story is that something about once you enter the public system is that it strips you of that part of your professional identity, the love for teaching, and overemphasizes to a fault the government job and the hierarchical structure of the government job. So when a teacher says, I am being treated as nothing like a clerk, when we think of it from the incentive perspective, we'll be like, this is the teacher who is purposely legitimizing her unwillingness to actually teach because she is a teacher who is receiving a high salary, and that's the social contract, and it ends there. Without asking ourselves, is there something about her day to day life that is demeaning her and making her feel that she is nothing but a clerk, which then takes away from her the desire to reclaim the teaching part, the love for teaching part of her professional identity. So, to my mind, the reason why, whether it is tracing learning improvement plans in Madhya Pradesh or sticking in a biometric into a health center in Karnataka, some of the very, very important and informative RCTs that we have all learned from, none of which have seen, they've all puzzled over why these incentive shifting efforts haven't led to outcomes oriented change. Perhaps one of the reasons is that we're not hitting at the core part of reaffirming professional identity of public sector workers aligned to the purpose of the specific tasks that they have been assigned to.
And Yamini, that immediately then brings me to the thing that, I'm in the middle of, I think, interviewing middle-aged elite men for my next book. And it's the
Shrayana, you're getting us
study.
all into good,
Yeah, this
good
is
masala territory.
I have deep stakes in your role as a thought leader on this. Uh, but let me no, but let me come back to this, which is that when I talk to them about the state, and you can't have a conversation with any Indian without the state actually coming up. It's such a live topic of conversation across the country. And one of the first things that you'll hear, it's a very standard response, is first, of course, there's the issue of, punish, incentive. You address that right now. You said that, well, we know that even if you get the right incentives in place, if you don't have the right motivations and you don't understand the context in which these activities are embedded, you will fail to understand why some of those incentives are not scaling, right? So if teachers are no longer enjoying being teachers, then trying to stick as many cameras in the room may really not shift behaviors too much, right?
Or even
Especially in
asked to be. It's not part of what legitimizes your role in
exactly.
the system, to be talking to your colleagues about the challenges you saw in the classroom, but complaining about everything or responding to the orders that you have received in the hierarchy. Remember, actually, Shrayana, you were with me when we were sitting in a BEO's office in what was at the time undivided Andhra Pradesh, and we were asking about, and he was sort of surrounded with these reams of papers, and this was when we were, for those of you who were not with Shreyana and me at the time, this was when we were experimenting with the idea of time use surveys for frontline workers to try and really get to the heart of what they do and what is the context in which they determine their day-to-day activities. So, you can't walk into a government office and find job profiles, although all of us, before we apply for jobs, expect to see a JD and then we align our work to the JD. That doesn't exist in the government system. And so we were trying to understand, what do they do? And we found that their daily, with some caricature, their daily activity is all aligned to what order has come from the top at what point, and then everyone's scurrying around trying to like follow the demands of that order. And I'm going to digress for a second because it's a fun story, but you weren't with me on this particular trip, but I was in Madhya Pradesh when we were doing the one of the at the time use tracking surveys, and we were waiting in the BEO's office. Finally, he shows up and takes off his Ray-Bans and sits down with all his 5 phones, looking really harangued because he had been given an order that morning to call up all the CRCCs, the Cluster Resource Center coordinators who were in charge of 15 schools, to find out if the Surya Namaskar had been performed in the assembly in those schools in the morning. And, like all other work, be damned, it's a block office, so there's citizens milling around, there are other officers milling around, there's us Delhi madam types hanging around. But this man had no time for anything. He sat down, he offered us tea, and then he was, his phone was buzzing because, acha, aapne dekha, ho gaya, has it happened? Okay, he puts the phone down and the next one comes, right? So, back to when you and I were sitting in Andhra Pradesh and we asked the BEO, so what is performance for you? And he kind of put it really succinctly. He said, performance for me is answering the orders of the paperwork and moving it up. Once you have done that, you have done that job. And as a CRCC in Bihar then took it to the next level, he says, you see, these jobs are after you have, sent your paperwork up, then it is complete rest in comfortable conditions. That is the CRCC's job. Now, you can argue that this is because he's a lazy, incompetent worker, or you can say that this might well also be because of the kind of performance incentives he has been given. And those performance incentives are not linked to if you send your data up or your paper up, your salary will be increased by 2%. It is that this is what the organization demands. This is what the feedback loop is telling me. We operate in this hierarchical structure, and therefore this is what I'll do. Sorry, I digressed, but you gave me an
No,
opening
no, that was a very
flesh this
useful
out.
digression. I think, again, to reiterate the point that our understanding of incentives needs to be deeply embedded in the sociological context. I mean, it's not just a question of thinking about political economy, which in India often just tends to be about voting patterns and blocks and lines, but the actual sociology of these organizations. And I think the book does that so beautifully, I think, drawing on that literature. But let me go back to my uncles, right? So
Sorry.
when I asked them about the state, the immediate response is, well, the problem is we've got all the wrong people manning the state, right? That the people in the state just need to be completely either just fired, we need a new kind of talent, we need to be thinking about recruitment processes differently. Some of that is a powerful argument. And I know there have been many conversations about, is there lateral entry? At what level should there be lateral entry? I know you've been writing about this and thinking about it a lot. How would you respond to that argument that perhaps one of the best ways to address challenges of state capacity is to radically redesign the way we are recruiting, who we are recruiting, how we're thinking about that recruitment. And I know you'll nuance it. And how different is it? When you're thinking about a block education officer vis-a-vis, when we're thinking about the larger, rather elite administrative services. Could you reflect on that, on recruitment and radical restructuring of the way the state is hiring and firing its own workers?
Thanks, Shana. You're right. I think this is there are two parts to this debate, right? One part of the debate on lateral entry is about the elite services and the elite kind of policy making skills that are needed against the backdrop of, a technology oriented 21st century. That, there are certain kinds of expert skills that the generalist bureaucrat may not necessarily have, and so it requires expertise that can be brought in through lateral entry. There are many examples around the world that are often drawn in Australia, even the United States to some extent. And I don't necessarily have an immediate quibble with that. After all, all of us as the larger policy ecosystem exist because our whole raison d'etre is that we have a set of policy expertise, technical expertise from both academia and the practice of academia and policy that we are bringing in to contribute to dialogues and discussions in policy. So the need for expertise in the policy making process is a well-established reality, and certainly there are places where the generalist may require more. I think the question is, where is this coming from and what problem is it trying to solve? So at one level, it's partially trying to solve the expertise problem, but it's also coming from a deep frustration with the state itself and a disenchantment, actually, more than a frustration, that, the whole enchantment that we had with the state from the moment, from our moment of independence, the commanding heights of the state that would lead us into a nation building project of a great future, which kind of led to a deep disenchantment with the state that has its tentacles everywhere in ways that curb the animal spirits of the economy. And in fact, getting the state out of the way was the zeitgeist of the 1991 moment that kind of, unleashed the animal spirits and enabled the economy to grow. And that disenchantment still stays, in that even though we've got rid of some of the state in some of the places where it ought not to be, it's still everywhere. And it isn't accountable for actually delivering on various outcomes. And so, can we infuse a lateral entry, a new culture into the bureaucracy by bringing from the outside? Except it misses, in my view, exactly that point, that in order to actually shift the way the state operates, you have to have a dialogue with the state, which requires you to strengthen parts of the state in ways that are responsive to the purpose of the state. We see repeatedly, the government of India, I don't know the exact dates, but, just on the eve of the 2019 elections, announced a kind of implementation of this lateral entry policy. They start implementing it in the early part of 2019. The lateral entrants that actually came in, you didn't see any massive change because they're walking into precisely the same kind of cultural context of bureaucracy. And it is that hasn't changed. And indeed, it's almost, in my mind, a distraction from the core issue, because the state, in fact, knows very well how to draw in expertise. It draws in expertise through all of us, all of you who are part of the Ideas for India ecosystem, all of the young students who want to be public policy professionals and practitioners. We are all engaging the state, and it brings in this expertise in different ways. Ultimately, the art of policy making is not one of experts writing laws, but of experts offering their expertise, and the political negotiation of law and systems coming into play, in which certainly experts play a role, sometimes inside and sometimes outside, both placing pressure and being part of it. But when you bring the expert in without actually building state capacity, you risk hollowing out the state. We are seeing this a lot in the hiring of consultants. A second route, which in my view is also a version of lateral entry, of the big four: BCG, PwC, EY, everybody who comes in on big contracts and actually performs functions of the state. It hollows out state capacity because eventually they go, you hollow out what's inside. But also, it just takes away from a fundamental accountability question. There is a reason why the state is structured as it is. It is ultimately meant to be accountable to its political masters, who in turn are accountable to the citizenry. And you cannot afford to break that chain, because democracy suffers. And in fact, even state capacity suffers in that context. So that's the kind of elite story. The same logic in some ways we tend to apply to the front lines of the state as well. And part of that, it's a kind of disenchantment with the harsh reality of the social value of government jobs. How do we address this? Because of course it is nobody's case that the state should be structured in such a way that we fall into this high wages, low outcomes. In fact, we have two running kind of threads about the state as we know it on the front lines. One is this consensus around high wages, low outcomes. And the second is high wages and actually very low hiring. The Indian state is very thin. Devesh's work, Karthik's work, we know this from a wide range of empirical data that has now been presented, how thin the Indian state is, particularly at the front lines compared to any other state at the level of GDP that India is at. And we've been puzzling over how these two consensuses have kind of sat together. And yet, one of the ways in which we are trying to get around this problem is to consistently suggest that perhaps we want to contractualize the state. That might, bring both the incentives and again, it always hits against the politics, right? The social value of government jobs is what it is, and all these contractual workers do tend to unionize and push back, and then you get an even bigger problem. So to me, really, the right way of thinking about it at the front lines is actually again to think about how do you build capacity of the state, not by seeking to hollow it out, and contractualization at the lower end is one form of that hollowing out, but in fact by engaging and empowering the frontline state, both with more staff. Because one of the reasons why we resist more staff is because we go back to the vicious cycle. You hire more, but the state doesn't deliver, and it's a large amount of taxpayers' money that is going into naught, and that's exactly the wrong way in which you should allocate scarce resources. So the economic value matters. But how do we actually think about working the two together in ways that actually strengthen and empower the state as it is, rather than consistently think of hollowing it out through contractualization? And of course, technology, and I hope we'll talk about technology too in a moment, which is also very prevalent as part of this idea of, given the recruitment structures and the political realities of state capacity, particularly at the grassroots, that can we bypass the state in different ways?
Yeah, no, and in fact, Yamini, I was going to come to the question of technology, but perhaps it's linked to another schism that I find very hard to square when I read the literature, when I look at the data, and also when you read what activists are putting out, or just the different types of knowledge on particularly the Indian welfare state. And the schism is the following. On one hand, we say constantly, and it is a fact statistically, that the welfare state, in terms of the number of people it covers, post liberalization, has just expanded. I mean, you compare this to so many countries in the world, and, by and large, food subsidies are going out around 800 million people. It's a scale that is remarkable, right? That's one. However, at the same time, the language to deal with the welfare state also is, well, they're partly freebies. We're not really sure whether we should be, investing in these further. Are these tactical investments in human capital? That's a question that continues to come up. And then the third, I mean, sort of linked to that is, well, but it's all a form of corruption. So there's a schism in the discussion where, on one hand, and we see this also in the change in the way I think the conversation around the food subsidy program has really evolved, where many people earlier would say this is, high leakage, not a strategic investment in people's lives, and particularly around COVID, a lot of that the narrative shifted, right? And then the solution is always seen as, well, it's technology, because they sort of digitize the systems, and part of it is true, but it's also activism, political coalition, so many things that many scholars have written about. Maybe I'd like you to help us understand this, which is, I know you're thinking about your next big long work might be on the Indian welfare state, and I know that links to what you're doing at Brown as well. How do you see the evolution, particularly, and when I'm thinking of the welfare state, I'm thinking of social protection, in-kind transfers, and cash transfers in particular, its expansion, and yet its expansion while there has always been this discomfort around the expansion, around questions of corruption, wastage, freebies. And then I'll come to the question of technology in a second, because it's always then seen as a solution. Could you maybe just help us think through how you think about the evolution of India's welfare state?
So, Sharna, if you'll indulge me, I'm going to read a couple of lines from the last paragraph of this book, Lessons in State Capacity, because I think what you're asking hits on many different bits of the argument I'm trying to make. And the core of the argument that I'm trying to make is that perhaps the starting point of how we think about building state capacity is to shed some of our disenchantment with the state and kind of try and imagine state capacity as a process of empowering the agents of the state rather than looking to see how you can quote unquote incentivize or bypass the state. I say the long term failure of the state to deliver on basic public services to citizens has legitimized a deep disenchantment within the policy and broader public sphere with the possibilities of what the state can do. This is why investments in the state, and very often when we talk about the welfare state, this comes up at the center of it. Investments in the state are often resisted, and getting the state out of the way remains the accepted framework in debates on state capacity. So, to your question on welfare, it isn't possible in India for a serious political conversation to be had without acknowledging the need for the state to perform at least some semblance of welfare. That's at the heart of the electoral competition as well. So the debate has kind of shifted a little bit to how to perform welfare. So is it about investing in public systems, or is it about kind of using this 21st century technology that has allowed us to be able to bypass the layers of the state to deliver, cash through DBT and JAM as one example? I go on to say, as a result, citizens and policymakers alike might have sought answers to core public good failures by seeking to bypass the front lines of the state. The combination of disciplining and plumbing via technology and the lure of private sector management principles have made the art of state building a process that seeks to hollow the state out altogether rather than invest in its people. In the political sphere, this has created conditions in which strongman leadership that compromises democratic principles in the names of efficiency has gained legitimacy. The repeated failures of the Indian state have left citizens impatient with democratic processes of consensus building, negotiation, deliberation, thus legitimizing the idea that strong leadership can deliver efficient public services. This view aligns neatly with what I call in the book the disciplining pummeling framework. It's really about the incentives we've been talking about on building state capacity. So I kind of read this out precisely to say that I think a lot of the debate we are having on welfare, it is the democratic processes and the pressures of democracy that have resulted in that have prized open spaces for this broad-based kind of expansion of the welfare state. What we have today is certainly a much more robust and large and broader based welfare state than in the 1990s as we embarked on the path to liberalization. And we have certainly made some gains even in core public, on investments in core public systems, for instance, universalization of schooling, primary schooling. So you do see more or less a school in every hamlet. You do see near universal enrollment. Of course, there are some hard to reach places. You have seen a massive expansion even of the public health system, the primary health centers, the CHCs. You see them. The physicality of the state is now very present in different, what, Patrick Heller calls it the expansion. The surface area of the state has expanded. And that is very real and true. That is largely emerging out of democracy. But when it comes to a broad social consensus about deepening investments, it is this disenchantment with state capacity that finds its way into us being somewhat quite comfortable with the idea that we should invest more in our highways and a little bit less in schools and hospitals. And it hits upon various nubs of reality: the overpaid teacher who doesn't show up, the overpaid doctor, where you have public doctor, MBBS doctor who doesn't show up, and when he does, you have a 50% chance of getting the wrong prescription for something as basic as diarrhea. Those are all realities, but our solutions to that have come largely from this desire to seek a market-based outcome entirely. And yet we know from every other developed country in the world that certain basic public investments are at the heart of what creates an economy that that allows equal opportunity for all to participate, right? So I think it's this disenchantment that legitimizes this debate, which is ultimately resource allocation is about power sharing and it's a political negotiation. But it legitimizes this political negotiation into this framing of freebies and raveries or whatever we may call it when we talk about welfare investments, because it is so closely linked to the failure of state capacity. Lant Pritchett and I had a paper that Lant very beautifully titled, like I can take zero credit for that title, on understanding the puzzle of taxation, and we called it, and we titled it, taxes as tribute versus taxes as price of civilization. And really, when state capacity fails, the fact that is that the vast majority of the population does think of taxes as tribute rather than taxes as a necessary price for civilization. And so I see the challenge of state capacity as very closely linked into legitimizing what is effectively a political battle about the kind of society we want to have.
Let me actually then bring in technology to this because, one very powerful, I think it's very compelling, and I think in the cognitive maps, particularly of middle class Indians and elite Indians, especially I think in sort of the technocracy, the idea that you can sidestep these really messy conversations about the political embeddedness of the state, what you were mentioning about the social value of government jobs, what you talk about in the book is to just, well, there must be some way we can use technology to then just tighten up the chain of delivery to make it more visible. Again, thinking of it as a contract, not as a set of social relations. If you can visibilize all the actors, if you can visibilize every stage, then immediately then there are efficiency gains. Some of it is true. I mean, it is a fact that the public financial management system has had huge impacts, right, in the way monies flow and then what DBT has done. But I think your own work increasingly also points at uh, that it's also a challenge. I mean, it's an opportunity to use technology, but then what next, right? And what is the objective and purpose of this deployment? And so my question perhaps to you is, looking at the state right now, where we see there continues to be a proliferation of programs. State governments still continue to finance schemes. There still continues to also be proliferation of the need for people at the front line, right? So be it, cadres or workers contractually involved in different types of roles. And the growing use of digital payments, we've really become, I think, one of the countries that is really touted as an example to study for others, right? In that experience, I mean, where do you think we've been successful in the way we're deploying technology to improve state capacity? And what are the challenges that it has also created? Because I think you hint at how it's also, to that phrase you use, often hollowing out the state, it's also creating challenges. Could you talk about what's worked and what's not working, and what might be the next set of challenges coming up in the way we're thinking about using technology as an aid for state capacity?
So the way I like to think about it is the following. The government has a wide range of tasks that it is supposed to do, and even the simple act of delivering services involves a whole range of activities or a whole range of tasks for the final kind of implementation, whether it is money reaching the right beneficiary or the rightful citizen, whether it is running the school or building the highway. There's a whole set of things that are involved here, which make up the whole process of implementation. And I like to draw on a framing that Akshay Mangala kind of builds on Lant's framing to kind of to put this, that kind of broadly break down tasks into thin and thick tasks. There are tasks that are verifiable, easy to identify, where technocratic input is required to go from beginning to end. The transfer of money with the jam infrastructure from one bank account to the next could be one example precisely of that. And then there are thick tasks that are transaction intensive, that require multiple interactions, where judgment has to be taken at the level at which the process of delivery is taking place. The classroom is a really good example of that, which involves a very different range of not just technocratic input, but it is shaped by the nature of the consistent interaction. And Akshay kind of layers on that society. There are certain activities activities that require you to go through just a sort of chain of hierarchical command, and A will get to B, or you could move from place A to place B. And then there are other activities that require deliberation and dialogue and political decisions and judgments to be made at the level of implementation. And those become more complex tasks. Now, layer technology onto this. And I think that it becomes much easier to see where it works and where it remains a challenge and where it actually risks hollowing out. I think it works on the thin tasks. So if your goal is transferring money from A to B, potentially at speed, technology will allow you to do that. If your goal is to ensure that all teachers show up in school, then I kid you not, they exist, the command and control centers in the secretariats that are looking to see whether the teacher has shown up, and with the IVRS and biometrics that we have built in that give the data back in at real time, and somebody sitting somewhere is checking to see if the teacher has shown up in the school. If that is the goal, technology will get you very, very far at speed, quickly. Seeing the state in this way from the top to the bottom will help in no small measure. Even in the schools in Delhi, to the extent that you could ensure that that the government circular, by the way, in our book, we track 8,000 of these circulars that are being issued, right? And the everyday life of a head of school and the secretary to the head of school would be to walk into the head of school's office and log into the MIS system and do all the things that were put on the CCTV cameras that were in the head of school's room, etc. All of this can be done, monitored, and seen. But if your goal is to ensure that the teachers are empowered to teach in the classrooms and are kind of aligned to that core purpose and are able to engage with students in different ways, then all the CCTV camera is going to show you is a teacher and children. And perhaps it'll tell you that some children are sleeping, some children are misbehaving, and some children at the front of the row are nodding their heads and taking notes, and the teacher is writing furiously on the background on the blackboard, which is the state of this of an average Delhi classroom. But it isn't going to tell you anything about what children are learning, because that is about the transaction intensivity and the dynamics of what happens inside the classroom. It isn't going to tell you, if we go back to the transfer of money, whether the money is reaching the right citizen or not. I mean, in the sense that the process of determining who is poor, or rather who is eligible, is a very dynamic political process that is determined through a social and political consensus that is developed, which is about deliberation, dialogue, and negotiation and bargaining. It requires state and society to come together. Swachh Bharat, you had all the disciplining and kind of transparency with all these amazing tools that ensured that actually toilets were built in a large part of the country, right? There may be some dispute about whether it was 100% or 90% or 72%, depending on different data sets, but we did have a massive toilet construction drive, which it was possible to do because that's a thin task. Building the toilet is a thin task. Getting through converting that into sustainable open defecation free, which was really the goal, required societal mobilization. And that's what in the Mangala framework would be the more complex task that is not easily codifiable, that requires a consensus with society. And that's a hard one to achieve just with technology, because technology can ensure that I got the picture of the beneficiary of the toilet and it goes into the MIS and the money gets transferred. But what happens after that is a whole different thing. So to me, that's a risk we are taking as well in terms of how we think about the type of state capacity that we are building. Technology allows us to be able to ensure that we are building state capacity for thin tasks, but the bulk of what we want the state to achieve for all the goals that we have as a society placed on the state require the state to be much more able and agile and be responsive to the more complex tasks for which technology is only a support, it's not the solution.
Yami, we've spent, I think, the first 45 minutes of this conversation going over, I mean, one, the lessons from the book. And I think that idea, I want to go back to that idea of that could you say that again? The interstitial
Spatial
spaces,
state
right? Thank
capacity.
you. And the staff room. And I think one of the things that, just to summarize, I think we said, well, if you think about incentives, you have to think about the embeddedness of the incentives. If you think about questions about how you radically redesign recruitment, performance management of the state, great. However, people's understanding and notions of performance are extremely dependent, again, on the way the organization understands work, what is valued, what is the social value of that government job as well, right? We move to then this discussion about technology and this schism, I think linked to it, the schism around the welfare state, that it's expanded, yet we need technology to no longer think about theorizing the state as looking like the state, but seeing the state, right? Completely, making it as transparent as possible. And yet the limitations
But
of
not
that.
to the citizenry.
So then the answer is, well, if you think about technology, sure, when it's sort of thin, direct, verifiable tasks, we seem to have these are strong records of performance. The moment you get into things that involve deliberation, such as prioritization of beneficiaries, thinking about targeting, thinking about other human capital services, that's where the challenge continues, and technology isn't going to really scale at solutions there completely. And I guess my question now to you is the following, and I've seen you have to handle this at multiple panels and policy debates, which I have stopped going to because I think it's, going back to my complete disenchantment with this conversation, which is, often I do notice that when you're in these spheres of discussing policy, we have got into this solutionism conversation. Everything is what's the solution, right? Give me a technical solution that I can then put on paper. It could be a law, it could be an order, it could be an idea, it could be a pilot. And of course, I see the value of that. The concretizing things and moving forward is very useful. But so much of what you're bringing to the table, and I think with your work and with the book, are things that are not one shot games. These are repeated, sequenced, iterative forms of building state capacity. And I think here we are really building on a lot of what and that body of work. Is it frustrating? I think that's my question to you. Is it frustrating to have this somewhat different approach to building state capacity vis-a-vis, I think, what is, let's be very honest, a very comfortable boys' club consensus on what state capacity solutions ought to look like? Um, and how would you, I mean, if a bureaucrat, and I know you've had these discussions with bureaucrats across tiers of government, how would you, so tomorrow we were to say, let's think about what Delhi did to try and reform its education system. How is this different from that very traditional, just give me one solution, keep it simple, ideally technology or performance management? How do you think, I mean, am I overemphasizing the differences between how you are approaching it and diagnosing it and what I think is the traditional consensus? Maybe that's one question. And secondly, how would you approach the question of perhaps when somebody says, well, now what? I mean, you're theorizing this, you're suggesting all of this. How do I implement this in practice? How would you respond to that? And I'm sorry if I was rambling in my question, but I think you understand where I'm getting at, which is how is it that we develop this conversation within all stakeholders in government and also the policy space?
So in a sense, how do we concretize the the lessons from Delhi schools?
Yeah.
There's a temptation to identify quick solutions, and it is not helpful to complicate a problem without then being able to actually identify the solutions. But I think what I learned sitting in schools in Delhi, and that's why Delhi was such a great site for this work. I should say originally this kind of started out as an effort to try and understand education reform itself. And as we went through this process, I realized that of course, this is about education, reforming schools, or what you should not do to reform schools. But it's also about this larger debate on state capacity, because in a sense, we had some of the ingredients that often come up as our solutions. We had the political will in place for a period of time, in that the highest levels of the state government, the deputy chief minister, who was also the education minister, had a complete free hand. And interestingly, education became part and parcel of what the Aam Aadmi Party sought political legitimacy through, right? So rarely do you have a political party. There were many other things going on, no doubt. And I'm not trying to say that, voting for the Aam Aadmi Party was on the voter choices were linked to what they did in schools, but you build political legitimacy by differentiating yourself. And one very critical element of that differentiation was the work that they were doing on schools. So you had that in place. And the reformers had some sets of ideas that they wanted to implement. And once we were kind of in the trenches, we actually noted a lot of the frustration that the reformers had as they were going about things. So little things like one of the key actors in this process said to describe to us as we how difficult it was to get the wording in the government circular changed, because our government circulars within the hierarchical kind of, Akshay has this nice phrase of the legalistic norms of bureaucracy, which rule following, hierarchy oriented. So the government circular becomes an expression of that, right? The orders, any one of us who've read an order will see it's written in legalese, and it's essentially kind of saying you shall do X, you shall do Y, giving XYZ things that you're supposed to do. The original idea of what the reformers were trying to do was to try and sort of be a little more warm and fuzzy about what they were trying to do, because this was about trying to shift beliefs and trying to shift the norms within how parents and teachers and how teachers and students engage with each other. At every time they would draft an order that was more kind of suggestive, it would hit back because the government bureaucrat was rewriting it in the language that he knew best. And, they would go back and forth on this. And then we saw in schools that when the reformers succeeded, so one of the ideas was in Chunauti in the beginning, there was a kind of reorganization of the classrooms into Nishta, and so where students that were closer to curriculum level expectations were grouped in a classroom, and students that were a little bit further away from curriculum expectations were placed in another classroom. There are, the pedagogists have a lot of debate about this approach, but the question we were asking is, how are the teachers viewing this? And from the point of view of the reformers, the idea was this would allow for teachers to kind of be a little bit more flexible with how they went about following lesson plans and teaching. And so the orders finally, when the reformers succeeded, used instead of saying you should do X, said you could do X or Y or maybe Z. And we would walk into these schools and like everybody was staring at this piece of paper, scratching their heads, going, is it or is it and? And if we do it this way and if we do it some other way, will the DDE, the boss sitting on top, get us into trouble and we don't want to be shouted at, etc. These were very real conversations. One of them described it as, we are used to operate functioning with a GPS. आपने अब map हटा दिया तो हम क्या करेंगे? So it almost became like the idea of the reform became like a tyranny of flexible circulars. I have to credit Rajesh Veeraraghavan for this phrase. He said it's like I called it tyranny of circulars. He said no, it's a tyranny of flexible circulars, because the system is so kind of aligned to functioning in a certain way. And into this, when we find solutions then, and the solutions that work inevitably are solutions that get interpreted into this framing, because this is what the reformers were also struggling with. So there were many flaws in how it got implemented. No reform is beautiful and clean from A to B. There's lots of layers. And while a lot of our discourse and literature on this focuses on the political elements of the layers or the plumbing that needs to be done, we miss this. You could have all ideas. Translation goes away because all the actors inside are embedded in a particular belief system. And so you embed the solution into this. Maybe there are some things for which command and control may work and other things for which a different kind of approach may work, but it's all coming into this. And this is going to distort it in the framing in which it is used to. Breaking this is not going to happen overnight. It's a long-term process. And the way to break it requires, as I said in the beginning, the slow boring of the hardboards, which is where the concept of interstitial state capacity makes sense to me. Because when I thought about what are the things that shifted a little bit and changed the terms of the conversation just on the margins inside the staff room, or when the schools closed and they came back after COVID, teachers were kind of ready to think about learning losses because so much conversation had happened through the reform effort for those years, and COVID kind of opened up that opportunity. That is, where you could see change. So I started thinking about what were the levers that the reformers actually managed to lift and were successful in. One of the levers was the training side. We talk about civil service training a lot in terms of the kinds of skills we want to impart. We talk about civil service training in terms of, now the Excel sheet, the Karma Yogi kind of thing. How can we use technology to give on-site training and repeated regular training? All of that is really useful. But actually, the training site is a really important place where the state and the mentors of the state, in a sense, which is the role of the can come together to really engage in dialogues about norms of the state and what it is so how do you think about a state that is use a training site to learn, to engage, and to break down belief systems and rebuild belief systems. This is a hard thing, especially given that we actually have hollowed out our training. I'm going to use that word again. Labasna operates, and many of us and many of those who write in I4I go there and we take a few lectures and we come. But what about the state training institutes, the ATI? All completely atrophied, broken, and when the state secretary has to quickly deliver on something, he's going to do the only thing he can, which is to call PwC and the World Bank and all the institutions that all of us have been part of to quickly try and fix a few things. But you leave behind this broken state. So I think training and thinking about training around the pedagogy of public administration in ways that address the question of norms is a really important lever. And that was one of the things that degrees of success Delhi government do. Credible sites of communication, training is one, but repeated interactions. In Bihar, when we were studying Mission Gunvata, we saw this in a really interesting way. Mission Gunvata adopted a similar method that Delhi did of the Prathams teaching at the right level in Bihar in the 2011, 2012, 2013, if I remember the dates right. It started as a pilot project in one district. And one of the most interesting elements of that pilot project was that the DM at the time, in the telling of the CRCCs and the teachers who would attend the trainings, would sit down in the meetings and not say, what are the 5 things that you've done, but actually say, what are the problems you're encountering in meeting the goals that we have set for you? And one by one, people would say things. He would pick up the phone and try and find solutions. Now, in a sense, leadership and hierarchy, the very things that I'm railing against, actually proved to be very useful levers for prizing in these interstitial spaces. But leadership and hierarchy deployed to this purpose of linking the action to the purpose of the or the goal, kind of created for these for all the actors of this reform the opportunity of understanding that this is not about being shouted at for not having done 5 trainings and only 3, or for just delivering on the performa that I have completed and the data that I have sent up, but actually thinking a little bit harder about where are the bottlenecks and what are these things that I need to that I need to resolve. So I think that was another, the reorienting the nature of leadership, and I draw on this conceptual contract that has actually been used in how we think about firms that have innovated, that we also have to think about the contracts in the terms of the contract within the bureaucratic structure from that perspective of infusing elements of relationality that can allow for these subtle tactile changes, which is about shifts in leadership and management. And the last thing is just consistent and constant exposure to all actors to possibilities of change. Teachers didn't like these camps. And we would always find ourselves back in the same story that I began with of the Bihar secretary saying we can do the camps and missions, but we don't know how to routinize all of this into the system and structures of the state and get the outcomes that we get in these short missions. But consistent infusions exposes to the possibilities of change and make them more and more empowered to think about the flexible circular, not as a tyranny, but as something that can be them to serve their purpose. And all these 3 elements were there in consistently present in the attempts that the Delhi school reformers were making as they were embedding some of their ideas into schools. It's a long process. You're not going to get the outcome in a year, 2 or 5. And perhaps you may not have outcomes in terms of the actual, and input, you expect to see some increase. You may not even see that, but you have to perhaps shift the goalpost also. I'm not saying that we shouldn't track those tangible outcomes, but we also may want to shift the goalpost of saying, can we as evaluators, I mean, as academics, we're all always looking to study process and evaluate outcomes. Can we also think of understanding process and engaging with process to see are processes leading to subtle shifts? We as academics and researchers contributing to the discourse on state capacity could also maybe add this as a very important part of the whole framing in how we study, engage, and dialogue and debate state capacity.
Let me perhaps close with this. I mean, I think, for anybody who's wanting an elevator pitch on what Yamini's thesis on solutions perhaps is, I think you set it out so beautifully. You said training, you said create consistent spaces for sites of dialogue and monitoring those sites of dialogue. And third is learning platforms, right? Where there's a constant opportunity to see changes in the system. And obviously, all of this requires leadership. And I wonder which, where in the disciplinary frameworks that we're now thinking about public policy, where will a lot of that come from, this kind of thinking? And I think my last question to you is, right in the beginning, I mentioned that I'd ask you, what is public policy scholar? What does that mean? And often I think the reason I'm asking you that is because so often it has become very synonymous with economics and academics. I mean, I actually forget economics. When I go to, I mean, part of my frustration with all these conferences and platforms is you never see social workers. You only see extremely powerful people in positions of leadership and administration, but rarely at, sort of sites of discussions on policy. You don't see different perspectives. I think it's still limited, right? Forget, I mean, other sort of social indicators of who's present. And my question to you now is the last question. I mean, how do you see the study of public policy? I think you put that very important question of method, right, at the heart of it. How do we open that up? I mean, we are seeing globally what's happening to perhaps the education of public policy. I think, there will be need to think very closely about building stronger institutions within India to study public policy, to offer advice on public policy. A lot of that is already happening, but to grow those institutions, what are certain things that you would like to see? And I know you go and do lectures at these institutions. What would you like to see in their curriculum that would be different? And I do, I mean, I certainly think from my part, I do think too much centering of economics and economic frameworks has happened in the way we think about public policy. Discipline is always helpful, but surely there might be a more democratic way to think about state capacity. And I think your book is really forcing us to think about different methods and the different ways in which we study public policy. How would you design a future curriculum for a public policy scholar?
One of the big challenges with multidisciplinary approaches is that you also don't want to be jack of all, master of none in a sense, but you don't want to be a master of none that kind of stays within the silo. So that's kind of the challenge, right? Having a disciplinary anchor is really important, but building off that disciplinary anchor into curiosity to open yourself up matters. And we've been talking so much about incentives, but I think that the ways in which disciplines are organized and the power of knowledge is structured and is such that breaking that into a more integrated, genuinely multidisciplinary story is a hard one, and it requires shifts also in the gatekeeping of disciplines, which is not something that a public policy school can necessarily take on its own. Of course, it can dialogue, but I would say very quickly, maybe there are two ways of thinking about this. One is just field building. So I think that the Indian literature on public policy and the state itself is remarkably thin. We know very little. Like we get anecdotes through increasingly now civil servants write about their biography, but public administration has never been a discipline, and so in India, and actually now globally, it's almost disappeared as. So you don't actually have a strong field of literature, textbooks that you can draw on. In this book, for example, I wanted to try and locate some of the ideas that the Delhi government was putting into practice into the history of how public policy has evolved for school education. And in fact, it was quite hard to do it because a lot of this sits in different government documents, different World Bank documents, the minds of various actors who are still around. It's in their own experiential knowledge, but it's rarely been. We don't know the histories of education policy. We don't know the histories of health policy. Government doesn't. So, the new education policy of 2020 acts as though it is the first time it's created a new education policy, whereas we've had a history of it. And you see, when you start diving into these documents, continuities and, ruptures, and both of those are important to understand. So the absence of this literature is a very big issue. And I think many of us as academics can at least contribute to that kind of field building, just looking at histories of our institutions, histories of even the evolution of the teaching cadre. We know we don't have these as textbooks that we can bring into a public policy classroom. So I think that's a really important issue that needs to be addressed, and perhaps some cross-disciplinary kind of coming together of academics to build this field may be very helpful. There's a very interesting piece of work that Louis Tillon has just done on the history of welfare, and it brought out some interesting narratives about the early years of the emergence of the Indian welfare state, where that many scholars, myself included, just had no clue about, because it's just, it sits in the archives. And so I think that's a one big thing that needs to be addressed. The second pedagogical innovation that I think Indian public policy schools, as they're emerging, are very, very well placed to build is to think about the teaching of public policy through the practice of public policy. So a large number of people who go in to teach, as well as students who are coming in, have had some degrees of experience, and the sites of study are all around. So, of course, there are theoretical and methodological training that is required, but can that be very closely baked into actually thinking about a problem from the ground up? So, you and I talk a lot about the need to reimagine social policy in the context of urban informal workers. Can we actually bring that into the pedagogy of teaching public policy, take a scheme, and then really get students to go down to the ground, see it, think about it, come back, put their analytical hat on, all that they have learned in theory, and then bridge the two together? So can we make these a lot more practice oriented? And of course, the biggest challenge of all is that ultimately you go to school and you train people for a job. Your knowledge and jobs come together. And given, the fact that we are confronting a very turbulent world in which the resources, the finances, the governance architecture of international development, and therefore innovation and research, even within countries, and civil society action within countries, is all in turmoil. I think, where these students are going to go should also be part of the thinking. I have no answers to that, but we can't talk about what public policy training should look like without recognizing this turbulence that we now confront. So I don't think I've given you a good answer, but just things that I've been thinking about.
No, I mean you affirm my frustration, so that was very nice to hear. But I think you did give us two very useful things to think about. I think the notion of field building bodies of literature, and also the idea of thinking about a very practical practice as teaching. So like Land Pritchard is a professor of development practice, right? So I mean, at least when he taught us, and I think maybe building on that is perhaps a very interesting way to go. Thank you, Yamini. This was such a lovely conversation. It's been years in making. And for everybody who's watching us, I cannot recommend reading this book enough. Please, please go pick up your copy. There are practical lessons in state capacity, and Yamini is interested in talking to all of us, not just those in power. So please go read the book. And thanks a million, Yamini. It was such a pleasure.
Thank you, Shrayana. It was a real pleasure and really fun to go through the book and so much else. And thanks to I4I, Nikita, and Nalini for organizing this. Really enjoyed the conversation.